Thanks for the 10-year pitch. I have slides, but I'm not sure if things are set up.
Yeah.
Does anyone know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Jimmy Jenkins, Martin's running.
That was going to be a slide.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Social conflict.
Leather straps go over
Someone volunteer to do that?
10 minutes?
Throw something at me.
How about one of my kids?
Okay, I guess I'll like run back and forth between the mic and the slides. Sorry, it's not great visual here. So I'm going to try to. That's really hard to follow the music. It was really beautiful, and I'm going to talk about like social struggles and social conflict in philosophy, like talk about it in a philosophical way. But so bear with me. First, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for all the amazing people that put this together. They're just incredible, incredible people. I have to say, when I get overwhelmed with the world and all the things that we need to do and need to change, I really actually just think about Denver Homeless out loud and what people are building in this community, and it sustains me. And that's not bullshit, right? That's for real. Nice, thank you for that. So, thank you. It's something, that power that's created by the community here needs to be supported, needs to be cultivated, needs to be replicated. Because what Denver Homeless Out Loud is doing is building something very beautiful in the face of adversity, and I think, to be more specific, in the face of adversaries. And I think the reason I want to talk about disappearance, this idea of disappearance, which is a little bit strange, I'm sure, if you've never thought about it before, never heard me talk before. I want to talk about it because it makes explicit some of the social conflicts, some of the adversity and adversaries that are involved in these issues of social justice and housing justice. And so I think this concept of disappearance helps us understand that conflict, helps us understand our cities as terrains of conflict, and even more, informs us in a way, helps us understand them in a way that allows us to transform them. Theory. I'm not just giving an analysis and explanation of things. I'm trying to come up with a way of explaining things that gives us some leverage, some critical insight to use against our adversaries. How's the volume now? Is that all right?
Beautiful.
Good. Okay. Let me drop this. Okay, I'm going to try to be brief, and I'll get called out at 10 minutes, and then I'll go over 10 minutes a little bit, so we have a little time for conversation. I also want to say that if you find any of the things interesting, anything that I'm saying interesting, which I hope you do, you can pursue those ideas in our super fantastic Denver Homeless Out Loud biennial booklet, because I have a text in there about this idea of disappearance and social conflict. So please check it out. Also, we're still fundraising for that booklet. We haven't quite paid for it yet. So if you have the means to contribute, we're trying to get these booklets in as many hands as possible, and we need your help. There's a Fundly online account that you can donate to, or just talk to one of the folks at Denver Homeless Out Loud, or grab me afterwards and we'll make it happen. Okay, let me start with the next slide. There's only a few. Thank you. Okay, so built environments and their regulation can either enable or disable our bodies and the satisfaction of our needs. Spaces, city spaces are divided and regulated in ways that reflect certain interests and certain needs. And that regulation and that division excludes other interests and other needs. When laws are passed, when ordinances are passed, they enable some people and they disable others. If you think about mobility, almost everyone has the possibility for mobility. But then you think about the ways our cities are constructed. Those who are in wheelchairs, those who are trying to move all of their personal belongings with a shopping cart. When they're at the base of a staircase or trying to go over a sidewalk that's under construction or non-existent. Those are spaces that are not catering to that person's needs. The reason I'm talking about spaces as either enabling or disabling is to make a distinction between the different abilities that our bodies have and the ways spaces are created to enable or disable them. And when we think about that difference, when we think about a difference between the biological and the social or political, then the concept of disability moves from the body to space and technologies that enable those bodies or disable those bodies. And that means it moves from something one is born with to decisions that groups make in how they design their cities. Right? Now this concept of disappearance is coming out of disability studies. And it's a social model of disability because it looks at disability as a social relation, right? One that is constructed by human beings. The importance of this concept for looking at housing justice is not only that it gives us a different way of thinking about how we relate to spaces and how our bodies are enabled or disabled, but it makes explicit, we get a kind of a tangible grasp on how social conflicts are written into the brick and mortar of a city. That these decisions are not random, they're not accidental, they're not unintended. You have a struggle going on between landowners and developers, business associations, city council people. You can boo if you want. And people with real needs. People who are housing insecure. And so if we take this concept of disappearance and we apply it to that context of housing justice, we can see how disabling conditions are intentionally produced by those who have other kinds of power. Not the power I was talking about before with Denver Homos Out Loud, and the power that's being constituted in this room right now by us getting together and doing this, but the power of capital, the power of the institutions, the power of violence and the police. Those are being marshaled against this power. Right? And so this concept lets us see that. Or so I'm trying to argue. Okay. So you've probably all had the experience at some point of losing yourself in an activity, a daily activity, a routine. If you drive, maybe it's driving. If you ride a bike, maybe it's riding a bike. Could be the most menial thing, preparing food for yourself. Things that you don't You don't have them in mind. You do them through routines. And all of the things that you need to accomplish your tasks fade into the background, right? That means that the space that you're in and the tools that you're using are enabling you. They become an extension of you. And you don't think about that happening. They don't see that cities are built for them, but excluding others. And so we can think of this as social power experience as social privilege. And there are really two characteristics of social privilege. One is invisibility. Those who have it don't see it. This is the most frustrating paradox of privilege. Those who have it don't see it. So they become a-holes because they don't recognize their privilege, right? There are children present. I have very colorful language, which I'm holding back because of all the children. But this is something I'm sure all of you have encountered. People who don't realize that something is built for them, that they see themselves in the world and you don't see yourself in the world. The world around you, the social world, the legal world, that allows you to do the things that you need to do. Right? That's privilege. That's what privilege is. Not having to think about those things. When experience is one of disappearance. So, when we talk about, and I'm talking about with a Y, probably some of you were, looking at the title of the event today and like, oh no, typo. Damn. Not a typo. Dis is abnormal, difficult, bad, right? Dysfunction, dystopia. Dis, D-I-S, is apart from or opposite. So when you say disappear with an I, you mean it's not apparent. It disappears from sight. It is not to be seen. The opposite is the case of D-Y-S, disappear. It means to be seen, but to be seen abnormally. To make itself an object of annoyance, right? So when your tire has a flat tire, your bike has a flat tire, when there's a traffic jam, when you're in a wheelchair and there's a staircase, right? When you have poor eyesight and the text is too small, right? These are things that break you out of your routine and make the world it impinges upon you, right? An experience of abnormality. And so this is very different from DIS, disappearing, which is to go away, to not be seen. Now, I'm sure many of you have experienced this moment of disappearance when something breaks down. But what I think is useful to think about is when we built in structurally, systematically, the designs of cities that make groups of people disappear intentionally. They are misfits. They don't fit in these spaces, and they don't fit in these laws because the laws and spaces weren't built for them, right? So they emerge as abnormal. Going back to the idea of privilege, I'm going to bring up Elvis Brooks because radio and explain the urban camping ban as being a solution to those who are obstructing the right of way. Right? And this is privilege talk. So, obstructing the right of way for people like him, not obstructing the right of way for people who have needs to bathe, to urinate, to defecate, to rest, and have to do those things in public spaces because they don't have the privilege of privacy. People like Elvis Brooks have the privilege of privacy. But because privilege is what it is, it makes it invisible. He doesn't realize that. Nor do all the other people who advocate the camping ban. Because they see those spaces, those public spaces, as being spaces for the leisurely activity of the privileged. It is presumed that those people in public spaces are able to do private activities, private things, in private spaces. And so when they see private activities, so-called, happening in public spaces, it's abnormal. It's an annoyance. It's an interruption. It's an obstruction of their right of way. Right? And so that's the other part of this concept of disappearance that is helpful, I think. It allows us to see how privilege, and especially the privilege of privacy, makes people not only not understand the need to use public spaces for these activities, but actually to judge them, make moral judgments about people who do those things, right? Who have to urinate and defecate and sleep in public spaces. Sex. Okay, so I've already passed my 10-minute point, so I'm just going to make one other point about privilege, which is that when your privilege is invisible to you, you attribute all of your successes to yourself, right? And so you're not just an a-hole, you're an arrogant a-hole. Because you think that you did everything yourself. Because you don't see how the city resources, public and private, have been marshaled for your projects. That everything is built around their projects while excluding others. Now, if you have privilege, you don't see that. You don't see that the city is an extension of your interests. And so you get this idea of individualism. The individual accomplishes everything. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, which makes no sense if you think about the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But I did it. I'm the master here. I'm autonomous. I accomplished it. Right? Those who do not have that privilege think in social terms. They think of groups. They think of community. They know that to realize their projects, they need others, and others' labor and assistance and solidarity. Right? And so this is a conflict that we see, and that is playing out. So, just to wrap up, I think, rather than talking about the unhoused and housing insecure as disappearing, as not being seen, I think it's much more productive to talk about disappearance as the presence of the abnormal because of the privileged, and that we have to fight that, and we have to transform our cities so that they satisfy everyone's needs, and so that people don't experience that disappearance. And I'll end there. Thank you. Well, no, not answers, just questions.
Recently, the Denver Post, or one of the TV stations, ran a series about how the businesses and stuff on the mall are a little disappointed that people are not hanging out, and yet, having slept out there, I notice a lot of benches and things that would be inviting for people to stay are gone.
Yeah,
So I mean, and that was, from my point of view, that was an intentional decision to make people move along.
Yeah.
And now they're having a consequence that they don't like of it because people are moving through that corridor rather than existing in that corridor because they've done other things to make it uninviting.
Right, and they're working very hard at making it uninviting. So some people call this anti-homeless technology. So for example, if you have, so the comment in question was about downtown businesses having moved out all of the things that would facilitate leisure and people congregating because trying to exclude a group, that actually people aren't going there anymore. They're not hanging out. Of course, their wish is that you consume, that you buy things, right? Right. So There's this thing called anti-homeless technology. It's a phrase some people use, using spikes under any kind of shelter so that people can't get out of the elements and lay down. Section benches, so benches are not open, so you can't just stretch out and sleep. Wherever you see those benches where they have the armrests in between, that's to prevent people from sleeping. When you get these benches that are kind of wavy, that's to prevent people from being stable so they can sleep. By the way, an artist I met built a foam core that you can lay over these benches and then sleep on top. It's like a bunk bed. You sleep way up on top. So there's like anti-homeless technology is being produced. But this is very common to create. So use of sprinklers, use of fences, section benches, spikes. These are ways of creating unlivable spaces to enable other kinds of activities like consumption, private consumption.
Before we take another question, I'd just like to ask that those of you who have questions, so other people can hear your question, either.
Well, actually, I just had a question about, I had heard a rumor that they were spraying the kinds of pesticides in the parks that were causing people to rash up. Is that directed towards us and the fact that we are often the ones sleeping in the parks? So their grass is more important?
I can't say.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can't say for sure, but I do hear this. I've traveled a lot. I've talked to people about this conflict and the use of these techniques to keep people out. And pesticides are a very common way. Especially you put up the signs, and they don't even do the use of pesticides. They just put up the signs so that people who are afraid to have any kind of reaction, allergic reaction, stay away. I would say I'm cynical and I'm jaded because of my experiences that yes, I would say that a lot of times pesticides are used specifically to disable people who need to use that space to rest.
One more question.
I chose you, but I didn't see if other hands were up, and I just jumped in. Two more, thank you. So, 1, 2, okay.
I was just going to comment or kind of piggyback on the first question about anti-homeless technology, because it seems like in Denver, there are always spaces where homeless people hang out, and especially homeless youth. And it used to be Skyline Park, which got torn down. It was a great place for skateboarding back in the 90s. So it was a great idea for the city to tear that down and make something new out of it and push people elsewhere. Then it was the area over by REI, which is under construction right now. And it seems like every place that becomes kind of a hangout or kind of well known, this kind of thing happens. And so, I'm wondering if there are any efforts that you've heard of to besides the Occupy movement in general and things like that, but to reclaim public space or fight back against it.
Yeah,
and from below,
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Denver Homeless Out Loud is at the top of organizations doing this. But there are a lot of other organizations, but it's difficult. Obviously, one of the things I didn't talk about is the policing and violence that's used around these public spaces, specifically to increase the value of the private spaces or private property around them, right? And so the reason that these spaces are being, in a sense, colonized is, and not being used by the people who make use of these in creative ways, make them livable. Those have to be destroyed because that livability devalues the private property around it because the privileged don't want to see that community. Right? And I would say, in my experience, just traveling around and living around the country, is Denver is going to be probably the biggest flashpoint on the issue of housing justice. This conflict, I think, is going to, it's already outright conflict. But it's going to explode because of the destruction of affordable housing, because of the investment that's coming in from private capital. I mean, you're dealing with big powers, and they bought off the politicians. And so it's only going to be people power to fight them. So I think in Denver, over the next couple of years, there's going to be huge battles. I mean, we're just seeing the beginning, I think. Things are going in the direction of greater conflict over these spaces.
Yeah. So hearing the way you, should I stand up? No. Okay. Hearing the way you're characterizing the problem of disappearance, it sort of sounds like, I mean, there's more than two sides to it, but it sounds like you could frame it as there being two sides to it, kind of like the philosophy side, which I guess is more the theory side of it, and then the practice side of that I would think would be sort of like urban planning, like how we're implementing that, you know, and like actually designing public spaces. So I'm wondering, I'm sure Billy's going to speak to this later, if Billy's speaking, but like, how would you describe the planning piece to this from the perspective of a philosopher? And I mean, some of it's obviously easy, like don't use anti-homeless technology and don't ever get camping bans. But that's obviously easier said than done, especially given like the larger social forces that planners are contending with and that kind of thing, and all that everything that goes into that. So, what's your kind of response to that?
Yeah, I mean, this.
That's really bad. Sorry.
That's a really difficult question. How do we win? Is basically your question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the reason I think, you know, I'm a philosopher, but I'm also an activist, and I value doing this kind of theory because it actually informs the way I think about these conflicts, and thus what solutions might be, where we have leverage, and I think that the power of private capital and of political power that capital often buys is great, and we can see how the institutions that it uses go through like ordinances, also through police, and also through physical construction. That I think we need to think about those things, different approaches that would democratize the planning process around those issues, around law and policing, around the construction of space, and then even, of course, pushing back against the power of private capital to just be able to buy everything. It's like assume that developers should be able to develop whatever they want. How we do that is, of course, we organize. And those who have skill sets in those different areas would best be applied specifically to those. But I think, you know, the simple answer is housing. Housing first. Yes. Housing for everyone.
Yes.
I should have started it. But it's important to understand why that doesn't resonate. Why people don't say, yeah, housing just for everyone. It makes sense. The reason they think that is because of that second part of privilege. They think people earned it. And that everyone that lost their home after this recent recession, the Great Recession, as if somehow it was their fault. And somehow being born in a wealthy family or being born white is somehow your individual accomplishment, right? This is a problem of privilege. And I think and this is concrete, I mean this in a very practical sense, we need to push back against that assumption. We need to undermine that belief that people get what they deserve. They do not get what they deserve. I will turn it over to the next group of people who will explain how we do that. But that's what we need to do.